Mark Reynolds had never seen mornings like this. Mist curled low over the rolling Pennsylvania fields, swallowing the horizon in soft white silence. His rental car looked like an alien among the horse-drawn buggies that moved quietly along the gravel road. He was here to photograph the Amish way of life for a travel feature. A world without modern noise, his editor called it. But standing there with his camera in hand, watching men in suspenders and straw hats move with calm purpose, Mark felt like the one out of place. That's when he saw him, Eli Yoder, a man whose stillness seemed to belong to another time entirely. Eli was tall and broad-shouldered. Sleeves rolled to his elbows as he guided a team of horses through the plow rows. The morning light caught in his beard, turning it copper. There was nothing extraordinary about him at first glance, except maybe the way his eyes met Mark's lens once and didn't flinch. For a second, it was as if Eli saw right through him, through the camera, through the world Mark came from. Then he turned back to his work, silent and steady. But the look stayed with Mark all day. By noon, he had met the bishop, spoken politely about English visitors, and been warned not to disturb anyone at work. But when Mark asked for help understanding the boundaries of what he could photograph, Eli volunteered. "I can show you around," he said in a soft, even voice. His accent was faint, the kind that came from people who never traveled far enough to lose it. Mark agreed, trying to sound casual, though something in his chest stirred. Curiosity, maybe more. Over the next few days, they spent long hours together. Eli led him through the barns, across quiet fields, into the small woodworking shop that smelled of pine and sawdust. He explained the rules. No photos of faces, no modern machines, no questions about the past. Yet, as they worked, Mark noticed Eli's eyes lingered longer than necessary, and his smile, rare but real, softened the air between them. Sometimes, when Eli spoke, his voice dropped low, as if he were afraid someone might overhear something more than words. Mark stayed in a small guest house on the Yoder's property. Sarah, Eli's wife, greeted him each morning with warm bread and coffee she'd brewed from roasted grains. She was gentle, efficient, kind, the kind of woman who carried peace in her gestures. "Eli doesn't talk much," she told Mark one evening while serving dinner. "But he listens. That's how he shows he cares." Mark smiled politely, unsure what to say. That night, as he lay in bed listening to crickets outside, he found himself thinking about Eli's quiet listening, and what it might sound like if Eli ever truly spoke his mind. On the fourth day, Mark took photos near the creek. Eli stood nearby, sleeves wet, water dripping down his forearms as he filled a bucket for the horses. The late sunlight made everything golden, the water, the air, even the silence. Mark lifted his camera but hesitated. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" he asked suddenly. Eli looked up, his expression unreadable. "Tired? Of living so quietly, so closed off." Eli's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "We're not closed. We just don't chase what doesn't last." Mark smiled faintly. "And what lasts?" Eli's gaze held him for a beat too long. Truth and work, the rest doesn't matter. The moment stretched, heavy with things unspoken. Mark lowered his camera. Eli looked away first, but his hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his trousers. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He walked to the window and saw Eli outside, chopping wood by lantern light. His movements were slow, deliberate, like prayer in motion. Sweat glistened on his chest as his shirt hung open. Mark knew he should look away, and he did almost. But then Eli paused, turning his head. Their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither moved. The next morning, the air between them had changed. When Mark handed Eli a tool, Eli's fingers brushed his and didn't pull back immediately. When they laughed, it felt softer, like something secret. The farm seemed smaller, the silence louder. Mark caught himself memorizing the way Eli's lips curved when he spoke, the way his breath deepened when he worked. Every glance became a question neither dared ask. That evening, a storm rolled in, rain thundering on the tin roof. Mark stood by the window watching the flashes of lightning over the fields. He could hear Eli's voice faintly outside, speaking to the horses, calming them through the noise. When he returned soaked and breathless, Sarah handed him a towel, thanking Mark for staying. Her smile was warm, unaware of the tension her words stirred. He says you make him laugh, she added. It's been a while since I've seen that. Later, when Mark went to bed, thunder shook the walls. He lay in the dark listening to the rain, wondering how someone could live so close to temptation and still call it peace. Outside, a figure moved past his window. Eli, lantern in hand, walking back toward the barn. And though Mark told himself not to follow with his eyes, he did. Because something deep inside him whispered that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the night that would change everything. The night of the fire started with the smell of smoke, faint at first, then thicker, curling through the cracks of the guest house window. Mark woke to shouting and the glow of orange light pulsing against the ceiling. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and camera, bolting into the damp night air. Across the field, the old Miller barn was engulfed in flames, sparks flying into the sky like fireflies gone mad. Eli was already there, bare-armed, yelling orders as men rushed with buckets from the well. The sound of horses screaming split the night open. Mark didn't think. He ran toward the fire. The heat hit his face, searing and wild, but he kept going, joining the bucket line beside Eli. Their hands brushed as they passed the water back and forth. Rough palms, wet skin. The kind of contact that burned more than the fire itself. Eli didn't speak, just kept working, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with focus. The two of them moved in rhythm. Until finally, after what felt like hours, the flames began to shrink, the barn smoldering in a haze of smoke and ash. When it was over, everyone drifted away to tend to the animals or pray. Only Eli and Mark remained, standing under the half-collapsed roof. Their chests rose and fell in sync. Soot streaked their faces, sweat glistening in the lantern light. The silence between them was thicker than the smoke. "You could have been hurt," Eli said at last, his voice hoarse. "So could you," Mark replied, his breath still ragged. "But you didn't even think twice." Eli shook his head, staring into the dark. "It's just what a man does. You help. You keep others safe." Mark took a small step closer. "And who keeps you safe, Eli?" The question hung there, fragile as glass. Eli turned, eyes glinting in the flicker of the dying fire. "You shouldn't say things like that," he whispered. "Why not?" "Because they make me feel things I shouldn't." Mark didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. The wind shifted, blowing the last of the smoke through the doorway. For a moment the world felt hollow, suspended. Then Eli took a step forward, close enough that Mark could feel the heat still radiating off his skin. "This isn't right," Eli said, voice trembling. "Maybe not," Mark answered, "but it's real." Eli's hand rose, hesitated, then found the back of Mark's neck. The touch was rough, almost desperate. When their lips met, it was like a dam breaking. All the restraint, the fear, the whispered glances of the past week, everything poured out in that one forbidden moment. The kiss was slow at first, almost a question, but then it deepened, urgent and trembling. Mark's hand gripped Eli's shirt, pulling him closer until their breath mingled in the darkness. When they finally pulled apart, Eli's eyes were wet. "I've never," he started, voice breaking. "You don't have to explain," Mark said quietly. "You don't owe me anything," but Eli shook his head, stepping back as if distance might undo what just happened. "I made vows," he whispered, "to her. To God, I don't even know who I am anymore." Mark's heart pounded. "You're someone who feels—" "That's all. You're human." Eli turned away, bracing his hands against a beam of wood. "You don't understand what this means here." "If anyone knew, I'm not here to ruin your life," Mark said. He stopped, words catching in his throat. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone." Eli closed his eyes. "Don't say that," he murmured, "because I believe you." The night stretched thin around them. Rain began to fall again, soft and cold, hissing against the ashes. Eli reached out once more, just a touch, fleeting but full of longing, and then stepped back. "We can't," he said. "Not again," Mark nodded, though every part of him ached to argue. They stood there in silence as the rain washed soot from their faces. Finally, Eli turned and walked out into the darkness, his lantern flickering smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Mark stayed behind in the half-burned barn, staring at the spot where Eli had stood. The air still smelled of smoke and rain, and something else he couldn't name. He touched his lips, feeling the ghost of the kiss, the heat that refused to fade. He didn't sleep that night. Each creak of the guest house made him think he'd hear Eli's footsteps returning. But the night stayed silent, the rain steady. By morning, Eli's hat hung by the barn door where he'd left it. A quiet reminder of what had happened, and what could never be spoken of again. Mark didn't plan to leave that morning, but there was no reason to stay. The fire had left the village restless, and every face seemed marked by questions that couldn't be asked aloud. He packed his camera gear in silence, the guest house still heavy with the scent of smoke. The field outside glowed pale under the early light. Everything looked the same, except him. He'd come to photograph simplicity, but what he found was a secret that had no place in the world he was leaving behind. He was tightening the last strap on his camera bag when the screen door creaked. Eli stood there, hat in hand, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. For a long moment neither man spoke. Only the wind moved between them, carrying the soft clatter of horse hooves in the distance. Then Eli said quietly, "We need to talk." Mark nodded, his pulse quickening. He followed Eli past the barns, through the damp grass, to the far edge of the property where a thin line of wheat swayed in the breeze. The smell of wet earth hung in the air. Eli stopped, his back to him. "I haven't slept," he said finally. "Not since last night." Mark stayed still, waiting. Eli's voice trembled. "What happened between us? It can't happen again. I've spent my whole life trying to do what's right, and last night..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "It felt like the first honest thing I've done in years." The words struck something deep in Mark's chest. He wanted to reach out, to tell Eli it wasn't wrong to want more than the silence he lived in. But Eli looked broken, torn between two worlds that could never touch. "You think I don't understand?" Mark said quietly, "I do. You've built your life around peace, but peace isn't the same as truth. You can't spend forever pretending that part of you doesn't exist." Eli turned to him then, eyes bright with emotion. "You don't know what this place is, Mark. If they even suspected, if Sarah knew, everything I've ever known would be gone. They'd call me lost. They'd pray for me like I died." Mark's throat tightened. "And what about you? Who prays for the part of you that's still alive?" Eli stared at him, breathing hard. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Mark said, taking a step closer. "But you can't keep killing yourself just to be good in their eyes." The air between them pulsed with everything they couldn't say. Eli's hand twitched at his side, caught between reaching out and holding back. "I wish you'd never come," he said softly. "Because now I know what I'm missing." Mark smiled sadly. "And I wish I'd met you somewhere we didn't have to hide." For a moment, they just stood there. Two men caught between want and guilt, between what they felt and what the world allowed. Then from far off a voice called out, "Eli?" It was Sarah. Her tone was gentle, unaware, but it sliced through the stillness like a blade. Eli froze. His hand dropped away. His face turned toward the house. The struggle inside him was visible in every line of his body. He wanted to move, toward her, toward safety, but his feet stayed planted for one last heartbeat. Then he turned back to Mark, eyes glassy. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't." Mark nodded slowly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know." Eli walked away, each step heavier than the last. Sarah's voice grew nearer, then faded as they disappeared around the barn. Mark stood there, alone with the wind, the wheat brushing softly at his legs. He could still feel the warmth of Eli's touch, the echo of that night in every breath. Hours later, Mark drove down the long gravel road leading out of the village. The buggy tracks in the dirt slowly disappeared behind him. He looked once in the rearview mirror, hoping, foolishly, that he might see Eli there, waving, chasing after the car. But the road stayed empty. Weeks passed before Mark developed the photos. He'd taken hundreds, barns, fields, faces turned away from the lens, but one picture stopped him cold. It was of Eli, taken the day before the fire. Sunlight poured across his face as he looked out over the fields, his expression calm but unreadable. Yet now, seeing it with everything he knew, Mark could see it. The tension in his jaw, the weight in his eyes. The quiet sadness of a man hiding from himself, He sat there in the dark room, the photo dripping wet in his hands. The words came to him unbidden, the same ones that had followed him since that night. They told me Amish men don't do this. They told him they didn't feel, didn't crave, didn't break the rules. But Mark had seen it. The truth that lived behind closed doors and quiet eyes. Somewhere out there, Eli would wake before dawn, hitch his horse, and go back to the life he'd always known. He would pray, he would work, he would smile at his wife, and he would remember. And Mark, staring at that photograph, whispered the truth to the empty room. They told me Amish men don't do this, he said softly, but maybe they just don't admit it.